than anyone else. Yeah, it looks like this guy enjoyed being the bad guy and tormenting others just like he was once tormented as a child. This remark was very offensive, and Edward warned that one more word, and he would not be able to control his emotions. Henry continued to behave so boldly that even the immortal spirit warned him of the danger and the possible bad outcome. He knew that such an enemy must have a weapon more powerful than any Henry had ever fought in real combat. Looking at this scene, Agatha did not believe that the student had enough courage to challenge the strongest warrior she knew. Unexpectedly, Henry decided to involve the rest of the magicians in what was happening, who until now for some reason preferred not to interfere. Addressing the girl as the head of the committee, he declared that the rude man was creating chaos on her territory, and that she was obliged to intervene personally. And if she refused, Henry risked dying in this duel, and this news no longer seemed funny to him or to others. Of course, he could have asked the owner of the establishment for help, but everyone understood that by doing so, he was putting Catherine at great risk. The girl forgot that this young master was a cheeky and shameless person, but she had to answer because she had no choice. Stepping towards him, she prepared to say what she had to say so as not to lose face in front of everyone present. With a smile, the girl declared that no one in her establishment would lay a finger on the young alchemist who had done so much for their pharmacy. Jimmy had never seen the black market owner up close before and didn't expect her to pay so much attention to his friend. But if she continued to act so defiantly, she would have to fight Edward, which was something no mage would want. Although, of course, she could show a couple of new techniques if Edward did not back down and insisted on his own. Their families were like two sides of the same coin, because they were responsible for the city's underground world and all trade on its territory. However, it was definitely not worth declaring war on Catherine, because it was Edward who had caused the mess, and any member of the family would have admitted his guilt. The immortal spirit and his ward mentally shuddered, realizing how terrible this fragile-looking girl could be when angry. Even Edward finally realized that he couldn't fight her now, because he wouldn't get any benefit from it. Charlie already understood what this would mean for him and reminded Edward how many years his family had been working for their common good. But for the sake of such a non-entity as Charlie, the guy would hardly risk his reputation, much less conflict with one of the most influential women in the city. Of course, he was not used to doing this, but since childhood the boy had learned to calculate steps ahead and avoid stupid mistakes. Then, adjusting his glasses, he declared that he would yield to Catherine in this dispute, since the hostess herself had asked him to do so. However, he believed that Henry would greatly regret not listening to his advice and beating up the elite guards. But by then it would be too late. The student realized with a smile that Edward was making his threats again, but now was not the time to take them seriously. He even demonstratively rolled up his sleeves, showing his readiness to fight right now if the enemy wanted it. In fact, such bold attacks were unnecessary, and Ralph understood that Edward had overcome his pride to retreat in this argument. But from Edward's expression, it was clear that he was barely holding back his anger, and such bold statements from Henry could instantly change his mind. However, he did not calm down, and hiding behind the back of the owner of the establishment, began to show Edward obscene gestures. At some point, Edward even felt a little sorry for stupid Henry, who never learned to appreciate the chances to save his life. Then he suddenly disappeared from the place where he had been standing a second ago, and Charlie realized with horror that he was left alone in the hall with his enemies. At the beginning of his journey, Edward fought against those who oppress others, but in the end he himself became the kind of person he once hated. No one knew how hard it was for Julia to argue with this magician, and the girl sighed with relief, realizing that it was all over. Of course she didn't show it, and with a wide smile on her face she declared that now her friendship with Henry had become even stronger. Looking at what had happened, Agatha still couldn't understand how the biggest loser of their group had become so powerful. Looking at Charlie, the guy said that if he owed someone else, let him pay back the debt, but if he owed him, he would pay back 1,000 times more. It seems that today is the time for the first payment, since he recently ordered Vincent to kill Henry, and I wonder how he will get out of it now. It just so happened that there was another member of his influential family there, whose power was not inferior to that of Charlie's father. Of course, after these words, the guy fell to his knees and would never agree to fight this student alone. He began to loudly beg for mercy, promising to give the guy everything he asked for, just to stay alive. Henry was not used to simply killing lawbreakers, preferring a fair trial so that the culprit would be punished before death. And he, with tears in his eyes, continued to promise that he would now stay away from Henry, and that their paths would never cross again. The guy didn't mind, but the debt would still have to be repaid, since Charlie valued his own life so much. The boy realized that Henry was forcing him to make a deal, but he was in no position to refuse and get into trouble. Luckily, Charlie's family's spiritual weapons were pretty good, and some of the artifacts would be useful to Henry in battles with monsters. This request seemed the simplest to Charlie, and he immediately declared that he was ready to give Henry any of his artifacts. However, Henry did not need the usual weapons of his family's bodyguards, and he was talking about the main sacred artifact, which he wanted to obtain. He had recently heard that many in Richard's family were artisans who possessed great spiritual weapons, and the best of them was Richard himself. Of course, if his father found out that Charlie dared to give away the great weapon, he would kill him. So he began to beg him to choose another one. The guy clearly didn't like these excuses, and he said that otherwise he would take Charlie's life instead of the weapon. But Charlie immediately came to his senses and, with a smile, declared that he would get any weapon for Henry, unable to refuse his small request. Then, in Charlie's hand, a miniature relic of the formidable sword appeared, which fit in the palm of his hand, and in this form, it was convenient to carry around. In order for the sword to take shape, Charlie poured spiritual power into it, and his family's energy gradually filled every particle of the relic. A few seconds later, the sword rose into the air and grew larger, and now the relic belonged to the one who could dispose of it better. Even Catherine's family didn't have a weapon that changed size depending on who was wielding it. The immortal spirit knew that the item made of thousand-year-old mysterious gold could break through any defense, and now it was in the hands of his ward. After this, Charlie asked again to let him go, hoping that this would be enough and the student would finally forgive him all his debts. Taking the relic, Henry said with a smile that the first payment had been successful, and now it was time for Charlie to prepare his fat wallet. The boy, trembling, asked how much money Henry wanted in addition to the blade, so that he would finally spare him and let him go home. Having calculated all the losses over the last few days, the guy announced the amount, saying that it would take no less than 10,000 to pay off all the debts. But he said from the start that the debts would be repaid 1,000-fold, so Charlie's total debt is now 10 million in cash. Only now did Catherine realize that this student was a very calculating person, with whom it was dangerous to deal, and even more so to get into debt. Almost immediately, the entire amount arrived in Henry's account, and it became clear that Charlie had finally paid off the debt, and they were even. Jimmy was delighted at how smart his friend was to form an alliance with a family that had always been at odds with Richard's family. He was once again convinced that it was not in vain that he had become friends with Henry in the first days of his studies at the academy, and endured beatings next to his friend. The only thing that was unclear was why his friend's new spiritual weapon was floating in the air above his head by itself. Was it really a new magic? But just at that moment, the spirit carefully examined the weapon, noticing that the material from which it was made was very rare. Even dark power was not enough to create such a sword, and one could only guess how exactly it was created. But Henry remembered from his past life that it was difficult to find powerful weapons in their city, so they could go to another country to create them. Then the immortal spirit decided to put runes on the sword, so that Henry could better control its power and use it to its full potential in battle with monsters. Fortunately, he succeeded, and now everything that the blade of this sacred blade touches will be destroyed. These seals on the blade looked menacing, and with enough mana it would be possible to cut down an entire clan in one fell swoop. Although the immortal spirit did not like boasting, in this art he had no equal except for Buddha, and only he knew all the secrets of alchemy. He also wondered why the guy was so keen on wealth, since he had recently taken 10 million from Charlie. It's just that Henry hadn't realized before how society was fixated on money, because even herbs for treatment had to be bought, and often they were prohibitively expensive. Looking at the guy carefully, the spirit asked what specific elixirs he wanted to spend his savings on. The guy suddenly said that he hadn't thought about elixirs, but only wanted to buy a luxurious villa and a car, like the richest resident of the city. But when the immortal spirit was about to pounce on him with eternal criticism, the boy explained that he had only reached the 9th level, although he had expected more. But mansions are often built on the outskirts, and those places were an excellent source of spiritual energy. The spirit had to admit that he had been unfair to the guy, because he thought not so much about wealth as about the strong aura around such mansions. Henry, although he planned to use it to fight mutants, still wouldn't mind living in luxury for at least a couple of days. The mere thought of him and Sophia driving around the city's spacious streets in a luxurious car delighted the guy. At some point, Henry noticed that his talkative assistant suddenly became quiet after hearing these stories, as if he was offended by him. But right now his hands were shaking so much that talking about stupid grievances would simply be out of place. Indeed, looking at his hand, Henry saw that it was shaking like a leaf and did not understand what was happening to his body. He had never seen such a reaction to an artifact, and Jimmy also became worried about his friend. not knowing why his body was shaking and what to do. Only Henry knew that this tremor foreshadowed a battle where the clan of demons would cross the border of the Empire and plunge the world into a dark apocalypse. And at that very moment, on the border of the Empire, several hunters were making a routine flyby and were flying past the mountains where they had recently seen mutants. One hunter shouted cheerfully that their patrol could not consist of 3 apparently. The authorities sent them alone as the strongest in the entire service. But in the middle of the conversation, one of the 3 suddenly saw a silhouette in the distance and hurried to shout to his friends so that they could turn on the protection. However, he did not have time to warn them, as the next moment the body of one hunter was scattered into pieces of meat. Only now did they see right in front of them the first giant mutant that had crossed the border and become the harbinger of the horror that Henry had tried to prevent. The elder loudly ordered his protege to take up a position, because the style of magical fencing was now very much needed. However, this poor fellow also immediately fell at the hands of the second monster, who had quietly crept up on him from behind. And now the 2 giants stood next to the last hunter, still alive after this quick and terrible fight. Looking up at them, he understood that they would never defeat these mutants, and an extra person would not help here. Now all he had to do was run without looking back in order to have time to warn the other hunters about the invasion. Without wasting any time, he took off, hoping to get ahead of the mutants and reach the other squad before the monsters had gone another couple of kilometers. But at some point, he lost control of his emotions, stumbled while running, losing his balance and control over his body. But when he fell into the snow, he saw something that shocked him, because the young hunter realized that he had arrived here too late. The entire patrol squad fell at the hands of a crowd of giant mutants, and he could only watch as all his comrades became corpses. There were so many monsters that it no longer looked like a simple violation of the border by a few creatures, but resembled a war that he did not know about. The guy counted 12 huge mutants, and each of them was strong enough to defeat a whole squad of experienced hunters. It turned out that these monsters possessed dark magic, which they were going to use to increase their army at the expense of the unfortunate people they killed. They called for help from the gods of the underworld to create an army of zombies and attack the sleeping city with all this mass. At that moment, one of the hunters, the first to die, suddenly began to move, although it was clear that he had been dead for a long time. The skin on his hand quickly turned black, and after contact with dark magic, strange symbols appeared on it. Then he slowly came to, but it became clear that he was no longer the hunter who would protect people and fulfill his duty. Yes, now he has become one of the zombies, called not to protect people, but to fight for mutants, becoming a puppet in their hands. A red fire flashed in his eyes, and the guy was no longer the same person he was before the fight with the monsters, and it was impossible to instill in him anything other than a thirst for murder. All these brave warriors who had recently begun serving on the border of the Empire were now going deep into the city to create chaos there. It's hard to believe, but this young hunter was the only one who survived that massacre, and only he could inform the Emperor about the mortal threat. It was incredible how much effort it took for the young man to overcome his fear. But he had to go forward and reach the city before the monsters. The enemy was already invading in full force, and, having crossed the icy wastelands, they would soon reach the city center. One of the towns on the border became the first victim of the mutant invasion, and was not at all prepared to meet them. Once in the city, the main mutant ordered his subordinates to kill all the inhabitants and turn them into unclean ones. The residents tried to escape, but it was clear that the monsters would get to everyone and would spare neither women nor children. At the last second, the unfortunate woman with a child in her arms realized that she would not escape fate, and that she and her child would end up in the clutches of a mutant. And so it happened, because the monster brought down its giant body on the victims, and the mother and son died under its paw in the last second of their lives. The rest of the townspeople also fled to the other border, but it was clear that almost everyone would meet the same fate. After all, the monsters did not act alone, and the hunters they killed on the border became their obedient puppets. They attacked people and bit them like vampires, after which the civilians also took on a dark appearance. Military planes immediately flew to the scene, but the pilots had difficulty aiming, because the monsters and puppets were mixed with civilians. It was easiest to hit the giant aliens, and the first one was hit right in the head by a rocket, but the monster remained on its feet. Turning around, the lead alien saw dozens of fighters and realized that it would be difficult to fight targets so high. The squadron commander ordered the pilots to prepare for an attack and be on guard, as the monsters could wield destructive magic. But now he didn't care, and he wanted to take revenge on the aliens for the death of every inhabitant of this city. But then something terrible happened, because the giants possessed not only enormous size, but also the dark magic of the god of the underworld. Therefore, Even on the ground, they remained formidable opponents, which meant that the planes were powerless against these cutthroats. The mutant looked up at the fighters, and a magical flame burst from his mouth, capable of disabling any aircraft. Then a black silhouette appeared high in the sky, and it became clear that one of the most famous warriors of the Empire had been sent against the invasion. The general himself arrived at the scene of the battle and warned the fighters that the mutants were casting spells, blocking the engines and lowering the ships to the ground. Yes, he was right, because stones suddenly began to pour out of the monster's mouth, and the attack was directed straight at the general's main aircraft. Of course, the general's ship was covered by dozens of fighters. But what could they do against magic coming from the ground? Finally, the monster's magic reached its target, and it was difficult to understand how the aircraft could dodge a direct blow. After the magic and the hail of stones, the ship was attacked from several sides, and the hull could barely withstand this powerful onslaught. The general did not believe that he had missed the invasion, and that the Empire's best intelligence had weakened at the decisive moment. As a result, civilians, even children, found themselves in the clutches of the monsters, and were soon to join their dark army. None of the hunters could cope with the onslaught, and the boys were left to accept a terrible fate at the clutches of the aliens. One of the guys with a stick in his hands tried to fight back until the very end, but he understood that now he would be fighting with his own mutant colleagues. The border was completely broken through, and the general realized that this day could be the beginning of the end of the Empire, the beginning of its complete destruction. At that moment, his hand was shaking just like Henry's had recently, because this powerful magician could also sense the presence of monsters. Looking up from below, the giant told the general in a terrible voice that they would grind people into dust, and even the most powerful magician would not stop them. After what he saw, it was hard not to believe the monster, but the general had one way to stop them. To do this, he used the forbidden technique of the 5 great elements of magic, which was forbidden in peacetime, but now was a different case. Opposite him, he saw the main alien and was ready to throw into him all the energy accumulated over the years just for such a day. Finally, he shouted that the monster underestimated the strength of people and would pay for it with his life today. But the mutant was unlikely to agree, because threats could frighten anyone, but not the alien, who represented death itself. As the general released a powerful wave of destructive force, an explosion occurred, the shock waves from which spread throughout the city. At some point it became difficult to distinguish silhouettes and understand what happened and who won this fight. But unfortunately, the general was already in the clutches of the giant, who allowed him to say his last words before dying. Realizing that his days were numbered, the general vowed to take revenge on the aliens and their entire race, even if after death he had to return to Earth as an immortal spirit. But without listening to the end, the mutant squeezed the general tightly in his fist, and all that was left of the old man was a wet spot. Immediately after this, the mutant felt a surge of enormous power received from the murder of the Empire's chief magician, and was ready to go straight to the capital. Moreover, the army of mutants grew with every minute, and by the end of the day all the inhabitants of the province were turned into dark warriors. And a second later, the giant suddenly turned into a simple man, outwardly indistinguishable from any other inhabitant of this province. He ordered his subordinates to give the prisoners to the soldiers as a reward. These pathetic little people would still be needed to increase the army. He considered humans to be a pitiful race that sought immortality at any cost, and should under no circumstances be allowed to cultivate it. Then right in front of him he saw an unfortunate girl, for some reason left alive, and it was clear that this captive would clearly not like what happened next. The news of the mutant invasion had already spread throughout the capital of the Empire, and the guard was preparing to send all its regiments against them. All the residents knew that last night hordes of mutants invaded the borders and killed everyone in the border province. For this purpose, a council of elders was urgently created, headed by the Empress, who had to make a difficult decision. The Empress understood that this happened because of the failure of her intelligence. But it was too late to think about it.